Hey friends, imagine standing at the church door in the 13th century, your whole life about to change with a single vow. The bells are ringing, the crowd is watching, and your hands tremble, not from love, but from fear. Because in the Middle Ages, a wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a contract, a trade of labor for survival, of youth for duty, of freedom for faith. Behind every garland and prayer was a lifetime of toil waiting to begin. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy stories that reveal the raw truth behind history's pretty illusions. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this little community stretch across time zones and continents. Now, lower the lights, get comfortable, maybe let a candle flicker nearby, and step back in time with me to uncover what medieval weddings were really like. Not fairy tales of romance, but rites of endurance, survival, and silent strength. Let's set the scene. Picture a village green on an ordinary feast day in the 13th century. The bells have called folk from fields and hearths, and they file toward the parish church with a bustle of wool and whispered wages. At the threshold, not yet within, a young woman stands with her kin. She is perhaps 17. She is not a princess nor a saint, only a peasant's daughter with calloused hands and a dowry measured in bedding and small stock. Beside her is a man a few years older, a tenant with 2 narrow strips of rye and good shoulders for the plough. The priest is there too, book in hand, but the crucial thing belongs not to him. It belongs to the couple. The church taught that a marriage is made by the exchange of consent freely given, and for much of the Middle Ages it was offered at the church door before the nuptial mass. The banns had been cried to flush out impediments the neighbors had heard, and the moment had arrived. They join right hands, speak the present tense words, and a life begins. The crowd shifts and peers, someone clears a throat, someone laughs. What they are watching is at once very public and profoundly personal, a union that the clergy want ordered and the layfolk want celebrated. The threshold itself is symbolic. Consent there, blessing within, feast beyond. It is a choreography that made sense to medieval minds. The scene looks simple, almost easy. In Western Christendom, you did not need an elaborate ritual to be validly married in the eyes of canon lawyers. 2 people could make each other spouses by words of present consent. That simplicity worried churchmen because it allowed clandestine unions that families could not police, so reformers insisted on bans and public solemnization. After 1215, with the Fourth Lateran Council, the Church pushed publication of the intended marriage, the better to expose hidden spouses and forbidden kin. To many villagers, this was welcome form and a chance to gather and eat. To many priests, it was pastoral order. To many parents, it was leverage. But even at its most ceremonial, the engine remained consent, and consent was supposed to be free. The truth on the ground was messier. Parents arranged, neighbors gossiped, and local power could squeeze a yes from a dependent girl. Medieval courts heard such cases and tried to untangle them, and in their records we find that women learned the language of consent and used it, sometimes to resist, sometimes to secure the man they preferred. From the threshold, the party would move inside for a nuptial mass. In many regions, the ideal form ran like this: contract and giving of the bride before the doors, the blessing over rings and hands, then a procession to the altar for the Mass, where the couple received the Eucharist, and the priest pronounced the nuptial blessing. In England especially, liturgical books preserved this order, while local custom could shift details or, by the later 14th century, carry the whole rite inside the nave. Not every village could afford gleaming candles and embroidered cloths, but even modest parishes could stage dignity with chalked thresholds, evergreen boughs, and a clerk's clear voice. Afterward, the crowd spilled into lanes bright with ribbons and into houses humming with the purposeful chaos of hospitality. Then came the bedding, a practice that makes modern readers wince and medieval neighbors grin. It was not uniform, and it was not the same as a voyeur's spectacle. In parts of Europe, the priest might bless the bed. Yet to understand what medieval weddings were really like, we have to look not only at vows and beds, but at bodies, especially the body of the bride, whose face by 25 could look far older to us than her years suggest. The wedding day sat within a cycle of female labor that began long before the first garland was tied. From girlhood, most women spun, brewed, baked, milked, gleaned and hauled, their work braided into every hour of daylight. In many English towns before 1350, women dominated ale brewing. They mashed and monitored the drink that was safer than much water and central to every feast, including weddings. By the late 14th century, the trade began to slip toward men, but the habit of women's continuous work did not. A wedding feast did not give a woman holiday from labor. It often displayed the competence by which she would be judged as a wife. Osteological studies let us peer beneath the skin of the past. Skeletal remains of girls and young women from medieval English cemeteries show signs of physiological stress, visible as enamel hyperplasia, changes to orbital bones linked to anemia, and other markers of past disease and nutritional strain. These are not perfect windows into lived experience, yet they consistently point to interrupted growth and hard lives for many. When we imagine the bride's face, we should imagine not a calendar's count of birthdays, but the sum of sun, smoke, pregnancy, illness, and long days that carved it. We should also correct a modern misconception. Average age at death is not the same as a typical lifespan for those who survived childhood. Many women lived into their 40s and beyond. The impression of being old at 25 comes less from universal decrepitude than from the cumulative wear of labor and the cultural expectations placed on the female body. Childbearing intensified that load. The older stereotype claims that childbirth killed medieval women in droves. Recent work that follows aristocratic lineages finds lower maternal mortality per birth than once asserted, though the lifetime risk across repeated pregnancies remained serious. For commoners whose lives were not documented in detail, we triangulate from parish and monastic narratives, miracle collections, and the bones themselves. The best conclusion is sober. Medieval childbirth was hazardous because sepsis, obstructed labor, and hemorrhage were difficult to manage without modern techniques, and repeated pregnancies with short intervals amplified risk. It was not a universal death sentence, but it was a recurring danger that shaped how communities prayed, planned, and judged. A bride standing at the church door likely expected to be pregnant within a year. She also knew, in her marrow and in the whispered counsel of older women, the costs that might follow. Consent theory gave women a tool, but a tool is only as strong as the hand that wields it and the world that respects it. Some women leveraged the doctrine to secure matches of affection. Others found themselves promised by parents, then promising in turn to escape worse fates. Courts might vindicate a woman who stood her ground and spoke the right words at the right time, since the law regarded those words as creating a binding bond. Yet social pressure was incessant. Marriage knit property, labor, and reputation. In many places you could, in principle, marry without your parents' blessing. In practice, a woman's livelihood often hinged on their approval and on the goodwill of neighbors who could help or hinder her household. The wedding at the church door was the visible tip of an iceberg of bargaining. This is why medieval weddings, for all their joy and music, were also evaluations. Villagers watched the bride move and work and speak. They measured her competence at the feast. They watched what she wore and who brought what portions. They listened for the priest's words about duty and fruitfulness. They noted how quickly she and her husband would form a separate fire or stay within a father's yard. Weddings created kin ties, but they also created new expectations and new debts. A woman carried them visibly. By 25, with 2 or 3 births, winters of smoke blackening the rafters, summers of gleaning bent over stubble, and a diet that waxed and waned with harvest luck. She could easily wear a face that to modern eyes reads as older. That face is not a curiosity, it is a record. At dawn, 3 days before the wedding, the household of the bride awoke in a special condition. The kitchen fires burned earlier and longer. Extra jugs were washed and readied. Groomsmen and bridesmaids arrived in measured shifts. Not all at once, for lodging was scarce. In a corner of the hall, her mother and older sisters laid out cloths, lined baskets, and rehearsed greetings. The bride, still trembling with excitement and dread in equal measure, sat at a hard bench, her fingers knotting and unknotting. This was the liminal time between promise and possession. In the Middle Ages, the betrothal was often a legal and symbolic contract, binding in its own right. It could take place years before the marriage, sometimes in childhood, with the understanding that the final marriage would come when both partners matured. The betrothal contract established obligations, rights, and a calendar of expectations. Breaking it without cause risked reputational damage or even civil penalties. In aristocratic circles, the betrothal sealed alliances, while among humbler folk, it gave shape to what might otherwise be vague hopes. The word hand-fasting is often used in modern reconstructions to invoke a binding pledge, the joining of hands with verbal promise. In certain medieval English contexts, handfasting functioned as a formal betrothal, sometimes legally equivalent to marriage vows. In a region not far from our village, the bride's elder sister had been betrothed at 6, and only at 14 had her groom's family felt she was ready. Contracts had been drawn, gifts exchanged. The bride's parents had pledged part of their meadowlands, the groom's family had offered a token sum and a promise of maintenance. The formal ceremony was simple. The groom's herald arrived at the bride's home, presented a document or ring, voice and witnesses above all. The bride, in that interim space between girlhood and marriage, bore the stigma of promises. Her reputation, her chastity, her obedience all hung in quiet balance. The village gossips watched for any rumor of breach. The future seemed already written, even before the wedding day. A family negotiation followed. What would the bride bring into the marriage, and what would she hold as her own in case of widowhood or separation? The bride's family prepared a dowry, movable goods, cloth, small livestock, tools, even a measure of silver or coin if available. The dowry was a portion of her patrimony or inheritance, meant to help establish the new household. In many places, it was the bride's share of her family's wealth. She would not bring dowry that impoverished her kin unduly. The dowry custom had grown powerful in the High Middle Ages, especially in patrilineal societies where the bride would live with or near her husband's family. In parallel, the groom's side often promised a dower for the bride, a life interest in certain lands or revenues should she survive him. This was her safeguard, her fallback. In legal and ecclesiastical theory, the dower ensured that a widow would not be destitute if her husband died. In many medieval contracts, the father of the groom or the groom himself designated property or income from it that would become the bride's dower upon widowhood. This negotiation over dowry and dower was not always equitable. The groom's side often sought to limit the bride's dower rights. The bride's side sought as generous a guarantee as possible. In some regions, the dowry could be held in trust or escrow until the marriage was consummated or until certain conditions were met. If a marriage proved defective, portions might revert. If the groom misbehaved or failed his obligations, the bride might reclaim part of the dowry. Among royal marriages, dowry and dower clauses reached astounding complexity. The queens of medieval Portugal, for example, had detailed legal contracts stipulating dowries and the return of assets in the event of separation. In some Iberian contexts, the dowry remained with the husband during the marriage, but reverted upon separation or widowhood. Meanwhile, the bride's family labored to ready what would be part of that dowry. The older sisters washed and mended her linen. The mother selected pieces of cloth, silk and wool, dyes already faded. The small cow, if it lived, would be counted in the dowry. More importantly, the most portable and precious items, jewels, raw silver, small chests, even salt or spices, were gathered. There were sleepless nights over whether the dowry would suffice. If the groom's side were of higher status, the pressure could crush a minor household. In Florence, by the 15th century, dowries had become such burdensome obligations that the city established the Monte del Doti, a public fund to support dowry payments. The creation of that fund suggests how steep the expectations had become. In the week before marriage, processions of gifts traveled between households. A fetching party from the groom's village might arrive bearing a small dowry token, a pair of gloves, cloth, a few coins. The bride's kin reciprocated tokens to the groom's house. Seasonal produce, eggs, perhaps a cask of ale. These were minor acknowledgements, not the full array. There was also a public reading or posting of marriage intentions. Church doors were inscribed with notices, names of bride and groom, the day of intended vows. This allowed opposers to raise impediments, consanguinity, existing vows, or prior betrothal. If someone came forward, the marriage would be delayed pending investigation. In some regions, the ecclesiastical courts required a waiting period or formal bans. All this was backdrop to the bride's inner world. She looked in the polished basin, metal or clay, and saw a pale, drawn face. In the candle shadows, she glimpsed deeper lines than she felt she had earned. She thought, what if I break? What if he dies first? What if the promises fail? She held the fingers of her sister, and they whispered stories. Your mother was 30 when she died in childbirth. Your aunt lived till 50, but kept lowering her expectations. These stories were as real as the stones in her path. She understood that the dowry and dower were not abstract legalisms, but the scaffolding of her survival. Without a secure dower, she could be widowed and impoverished. Without a dowry, her husband might chafe. The stakes were more than pride, they were life itself. On the eve of the wedding, after supper, the bride's family led a small vigil. The women prayed with rosaries. The young women wove garlands of wildflowers and evergreens for the bride's hair and the door. They laid fresh rushes on the floor and lit extra lamps, both as welcome and as talisman. They cleaned the house from hearth to rafters. When the bride lay in her small room with her sisters, they whispered blessings and nerves. The full weight of tomorrow trembled. She slept little. At midnight she heard wind among trees and felt the burden of promises yet to be carried. When morning came, she rose and blood pressed in her temples. The old midwife smoothed her hair, murmured a blessing. The maidens dressed her in her gown and veil, helped by candlelight. The groom's party in their houses practiced warily. They made last payments, confirmed the details. The church would receive them soon. The world would bend in their direction. The strings would pull taut. The rituals of betrothal, dowry, and dower were neither ornament nor ceremony. They were the architecture of expectation. The bricks of promise that framed the marriage were as heavy as hewn stone. The bride crossed that threshold not merely under the weight of her gown, but under the weight of the future. Dawn's light crept in pale through narrow windows, striking motes of dust in the bride's chamber. She sat before a basin of water, scented with herbs, rose petals, lavender, rue, though the idea that medieval people never bathed is a misconception. Many did wash before such occasions. The midwife smoothed stray hairpins, whispered scripture, and slipped a veil into place. The gown would be wool or linen, perhaps edged with braid or a bit of silk, not white in our modern sense, but a tone suited to her household's means, blue, red, green, or even grey. Her hands trembled, not with fear alone, but with history. The labour of spinning, the cold nights beside hearth, the pregnancies half-lived, the faces of older women she knew whose lives were short. She donned her outer cloak, walked down the stairs, heard the hush of kin in the hall waiting. Outside, the groom's party processed across fields and hedges toward the church. They wore their best, coarse tunics cleaned, boots polished, belts buckled. Perhaps the groom carried a gift called a wed, often a ring or brooch, which signified his consent and which the bride accepted to reciprocate. At some ceremonies, that act, the giving of the wed, served as proof of the union. At the church door, the priest stood, book in hand, flanked by clerks and watchers. The banns had been read and posted. Anyone present was asked if they knew a valid impediment. If none spoke, the groom, standing at right, the bride at left, swore his vows. The bride answered, perhaps with those ancient words, "I take thee to my wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, till death us part." The precise formula may have varied, and local custom often shaped phrasing. Then rings or tokens were exchanged. Again, custom and ability shaped style. In many ceremonies, only the bride wore a ring. The priest might bless hands, blessing or exchanging rings, then lead the couple into the church for a nuptial mass, or a shorter liturgical blessing if a full mass was not possible. The procession entered. The clergy sat in sedilia, the carved stone seats built into the south wall of older churches, awaiting their turns in the liturgy. The bride followed under veil, the groom behind, attendants trailing with torches or candles. The altar was decked with cloths, chalice, candlesticks, and perhaps evergreen branches or flowers. Inside, the structure of the Mass framed the human drama. There would be readings from Scripture, perhaps the epistle and gospel about love and mutual support, then prayers, vows, and the nuptial blessing. The priest would invoke God's grace on the union, solemnizing what the bride and groom had declared at the door. In some cases, the marriage blessing occurred immediately after the gospel or sanctus. After the Eucharist, the ceremony ended and the clergy recessed, leaving the new couple for the next stage, feasting, entertainment, and movement to the bride's house or the groom's, depending on custom. Outside the church, the air would hum with chatter and shifting garments. Musicians might play fiddles, pipes, or small harps. Children darted among benches carrying tokens. The guests streamed in toward the banquet hall, which in a manor or large village house might be the solar or a hall lit by many rushlights. Tables, trestles arranged end to end, were loaded with trenchers, flat wooden or baked ash boards used as plates, many kinds of bread, meat, pork, beef, fowl, fish when allowed, pies, custards, sweets, spiced wines, ale, and desserts of sugared fruit or candied nuts. The feast was meant not only to feed, but to display generosity. Extravagant weddings raised reputations. The sounds of laughter, clinking cups, and voices rose. Minstrels might recite poems. The bride and groom would be brought forward, perhaps toasted, perhaps coaxed to dance or stand under an arch of green boughs. But the crowd was also a jury. Some watched how the bride moved, whether she curtsied gracefully, how she accepted gifts, how she smiled. They measured her dignity. They weighed her kindness to attendants. The neighbors whispered, "She keeps her head straight," or "She seems a bit pale." The groomsmen would test whether she offered drink, accepted guests. Hospitality was part of the test. As the banquet wound down and shadows lengthened, the guests would prepare to escort the couple to their nuptial chamber. Here lies the lasting tension. The public drama gives way to intimate expectation. The attendants, older women, midwives, kin, would lead the bridal pair to the chamber. Some customs included a ritual bedding. Guests would ceremonially aid the couple to their bed, at times pulling aside coverlets, blessing the threshold, or lighting additional candles. This was not always a spectacle of spectacle, but it carried symbolism, the communal witnessing of the boundary crossing into conjugal life. In Germanic lands, a form called Beilage, or Bettelite, had legal and ritual weight. The couple would be ritually placed in bed with witnesses present to ratify their new legal status. Some variants required symbolic separation, for instance with a sword between them, in chaste nuptials, showing the ritual's flexibility and the church's ambivalence. After the bedding ceremony, or sometimes before consummation, the church might bestow a blessing over the marriage or the bed itself. In many places, no explicit public requirement existed to witness the actual consummation, but the ritual settling into the bed remained meaningful. In practice, not every wedding followed the full liturgical ideal. In small villages, if no priest was available, or if the couple already had an informal union recognized by local custom, they might exchange vows before a lay witness and only later seek clerical blessing. But for our bride and groom, the full rite was honored. After that, the couple were left to the hush of the chamber. The guests lingered in corridors or courtyards, drinking and talking, waiting an hour or more until the new household had taken its first step. In the chamber's dusk, the bride's hand trembled as she reached for her husband's. The weight of the day pressed in, prayers, the bed blessing, the route from public to private. She felt the scratch of linen under her shoulders, the draught by the closed door, the distant muffled shouts of last guests exiting. She wondered, will the promise hold? Will the new hearth feed children? Will the effort, the labor, and the years of service reflect in his regard? She felt older than her years, her body carrying the scars of labor and childbearing memory not yet begun. The night stretched ahead. The guests would soon depart. The household would be born in darkness, in silence, in hope and fear. A single candle guttered. Her husband spoke softly. Outside, a wind sighed among the rafters. The next morning, the couple would step out into a changed world, recognized, bound, obligated. But this night, heavy with ritual and personal weight, sealed the threshold. The dawn after the wedding arrived, not with fanfare, but with the cold breath of reality. The bride stirred before sunrise, extinguishing the single lamp in the chamber. Her new husband lay beside her, breathing deep in sleep. She slipped out of bed quietly, wrapped her cloak about her, and made her way to the small window to peer at the sky. Mist hovered low over fields, and a faint wind tugged at thatch. She paused, having never felt so small in so large a life. She found the kitchen hearth, where the women of the household, her new kin, had already started coals, stoking embers, fetching water from the well. A maid brought her a bowl of warm broth, more for strength than taste. She ate sparingly, for she already felt a tug in her gut, the unrelenting hunger born of labor that would come soon. From this morning forward, she would be judged less by vow than by work. The wedding had enacted the contract, but now the daily life began, and that life was far less forgiving. She followed her husband across yard and field. He mounted a small firth, a pack pony, with a bag of tools. She carried a barrel of water, she carried a basket of grain, she carried the weight of expectation. The peasants on adjacent strips nodded or whispered greetings. The groom greeted them in turn, speaking of the new marriage, of labor, of sheaves to come. At harvest, she would work side by side with male laborers, reaping, tying, carrying, shelling grain. But even now in the early season, her chores were manifold. She milled grain, kneaded bread, churned butter, tended to poultry, milked the small goat, husked peas, mended clothing, and rewove what threads lay broken. In the lean hours, she spun wool or flax, twisting fiber into thread by candle or lamp. Occasionally she baked small loaves or made pottage for laborers. At home, she boiled laundry in tubs, washed linens, scrubbed dishes, swept earth floors, and fetched more water when the well ran low. The walls absorbed soot, and the smoke stained her skin. By midday, the sun would beat on her back as she bent among vegetables or weeds, picking beans or digging for roots. Livestock demanded attention. The pigs had to be fed, the chickens gathered, the cow milked, the calves driven. On market days, she might carry eggs, butter, cheese, or surplus grain to the nearest market, exchanging goods or coin. In towns, women also participated in trade, craft, or guild workshops, spindle, weaving, cloth finishing, candle making, selling wax or used clothing. But in a rural holding like hers, the yoke of labor was heavier still. When evening came, she returned to the hearth with aching arms and dirt under her nails. She washed in a basin of cool water, scraped soot from face and hands, reapplied salves or herbs, often stored in jars tended in the still room, a chamber of household remedies, perfumes, herbs, and preserves. The still room was her domain in many ways. She oversaw the drying of herbs, the distilling of simple remedies, the mixing of salves and tinctures for minor wounds, drying fruit, preserving food, maintaining oils and vintages. She consulted the household almanac, if present, or old women's law, mixing comfrey, mint, wormwood, or barley water as needed. Often she made a prayer to saints for strength or ease, chief among them St. Margaret, St. Bridget, or St. Mary. She said her prayers for fertility and mercy and rest, though she had little time for rest. Her husband might share the evening meal, but the bulk of hospitality, caring for guests, serving food, keeping fires alight, fell to her. Once the tables were cleared, she tended the spinning wheel, mending garments or weaving patches. Late into the night, she lit a half lamp and counted the coins earned or owed, measured the store of grain, logged who owed tithes or service, reconciled the burden of dues or rents, all while the men slept or argued politics at the hearth. In quieter moments, she would catch her reflection in a polished metal plate or basin and see a hardness in her face, thin lips, shadowed eyes, fine lines around the mouth and brow, cheeks hollowed slightly by fatigue and hard food. She felt younger, but already she looked older. Her skin bore faint scars from scrubbing or thorn scratches, her hands rough, her nails fried by wood and dug earth. She pressed damp cloths to her temples. In memory already she felt the years before she should have. At 25, she would look, to later generations, like a woman of 40 or more, because the burden of labor, repeated childbearing, and harsh diet carved lines deeper than time alone. If she grew pregnant soon, as she likely would, she would carry extra burdens. She might wear a birthing girdle, a parchment or cloth amulet inscribed with prayers for safe delivery, worn around abdomen or hips. The rope or strap would be blessed, perhaps borrowed from a monastery. Worn during pregnancy and sometimes in labor, girdles were thought protective talismans. The midwife had a loom of talismans and herbal mixtures. Should labor delay, the midwife could call for male surgeons or barbers to intervene in extreme cases. Mortality remained a constant threat. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, infection. The midwife's aim was often to hasten labor, reduce delay, and limit the risk window. Her mind hovered on the possibility of failure, of death, yet she labored on. Tensions between husband and wife were inevitable. He expected loyalty, obedience, children, a smooth household. She expected respect for her labor, a fair share of authority, protection, support. Many couples faced friction. Sometimes conflicts over property, over dower promises, over who controlled the food stores or livestock might erupt. If the husband's family sought control, the bride might resist quietly, appealing to custom or church. Some women maintained agency through gentle networks, favors with neighbors, alliances with midwives, churchwomen, or maternal kin. The bride's sisters or her mother might send aid or letters. A widow's reputation loomed. Women knew that if their husbands died prematurely, their security depended on dower protection. So in small ways, she asserted her rights, storing her own clothes, preserving her own garden patch, or retaining access to herbs she alone tended. There were days when the burden broke her: a fever in winter, malarial chills, a cough in damp stone rooms, a miscarriage, or the aftermath of childbirth stretching her strength. Her body bore the scars of survived births: slight pelvic deformation, anemia, recurring pain. Osteological evidence finds signs of physiological stress in women of medieval burial populations: enamel hypoplasia, anemia markers, skeletal changes linked to repeated pregnancies and nutritional deficit. These women did not merely age fast. They were aged by life itself. They carried child after child in ever-tightening cycles. Yet throughout, her soul flickered with faith, hope, and memory. In quiet dusk hours, she would fall to her knees beside the bed, fingers clasped, whispering pleas to saints for strength, for safe birth, for children to live, for rest in old age. She pressed her cheek to cool floors, rubbed joints, swallowed bitter draughts, and nursed small wounds. She bore the labor of household, fields, children, skin and soul against a world that judged by yield, by fruit, by service. The seasons marched past, sowing, weeding, reaping, storing, feeding. The marriage survived or failed by famine, sickness, flood, pestilence, and personal endurance. If the Beguines found freedom by building communities, another kind of woman sought liberation in the opposite direction, through total solitude. These were the anchoresses, women who asked to be sealed into stone cells beside churches, renouncing the world and all its ties. They lived and died within a few square meters, separated from society by a wall, yet spiritually bound to the life around them. To medieval eyes, their withdrawal was both terrifying and holy. To the women themselves, it was often the only way to say no and have it count. The ceremony of enclosure for an anchoress resembled a funeral. When a woman decided to become one, she had to obtain her bishop's approval and secure a patron to provide her with food and necessities. On the appointed day, she would process into her cell while the office of the dead was sung, the same liturgy used for burial. Earth was sprinkled on her as a sign that she was now dead to the world. The door was sealed, sometimes literally bricked up, though usually with a small window left for communication. From that moment, she would never leave. One opening, called a hagioscope or squint, looked into the church, allowing her to hear Mass and receive communion. Another, called the parlor window, faced the street or churchyard, through which visitors could seek her counsel or deliver food. A third, sometimes at floor level, served for waste removal. Within this architectural tomb, the anchoress prayed, fasted, and advised, a silent oracle embedded in stone. In England alone, between the 12th and 15th centuries, historians have identified more than 700 anchor holds, though many lasted only a generation. Their popularity coincided with a wave of female piety and mysticism sweeping Europe in the 13th century. For women who refused marriage, this radical enclosure offered divine sanction for their withdrawal. No father or suitor could claim a woman who was literally buried alive for God. The paradox of the anchoritic life lay in its duality. It was an act of ultimate obedience, submitting to the church, renouncing the flesh, accepting enclosure, and yet also an act of defiance. By refusing the family's demands, by choosing spiritual marriage over human one, the anchoress rejected society's fundamental expectation of womanhood. In this paradox, medieval spirituality found one of its most subversive expressions. The church tolerated anchoresses because it could interpret their solitude as exemplary devotion. Bishops saw them as living intercessors, their prayers thought to shield entire parishes from sin and plague. Parishioners, too, revered them. Many became local celebrities, consulted by merchants, priests, even nobles, seeking spiritual advice. Yet their popularity also gave them influence the church could not fully control. The most famous English anchoress, Julian of Norwich, lived through famine, plague, and social unrest. Enclosed at St. Julian's Church in Norwich, she experienced a series of 16 mystical visions while gravely ill in 1373. Her book, Revelations of Divine Love, written in Middle English, became the first known work by a woman in English literature. Her message, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," stands among the most hopeful lines in medieval theology. Julian's writing reveals both the intimacy and the intellectual freedom of the cell. She contemplated theology without clerical supervision, reflecting on sin, love, and the maternal nature of Christ. Within the narrow confines of her anchor-hold, she carved out a space for speculative thought that few university-trained men could match. To the outside world, she was a ghost in the wall. To history, she became a theologian. The rules governing anchoritic life survive in a remarkable English text called the Ancren Visa, Guide for Anchoresses, written around 1230 for three sisters who had chosen enclosure. The author, an anonymous cleric, advised them on prayer, reading, chastity, and daily routine. He described the ideal anchoress as a lover of God and prisoner of love. His instructions balanced asceticism with practicality. He warned against excessive fasting that might lead to pride or illness and permitted reading holy books in English, a rare concession to women's literacy. The Ancren Vis also addressed temptations. The anchoress must not gossip through her window, gaze at men, or take pleasure in worldly news. Yet the very need to warn her shows how much human contact persisted. Anchor-holds were not as silent as legend suggests. They buzzed with conversation, confession, and the hum of local curiosity. To modern eyes, voluntary imprisonment seems pathological, but in the Middle Ages, enclosure functioned as a social and spiritual contract. The anchoress's prayers were believed to sustain her community. Patrons supported her financially in exchange for intercession, a spiritual economy of reciprocity. Rich households sometimes adopted an anchoress as their personal intercessor, sending food and gifts in return for prayers for their souls. Documents from the Bishopric of Winchester record annual stipends paid to several anchoresses, 2 bushels of wheat, a gallon of wine, and a pound of wax each year, along with clothing on feast days. In return, the anchoress promised to pray daily for her benefactors. Some anchor-holds even became pilgrimage sites. The cell of Christina Carpenter, anchoress of Shear in Surrey, drew visitors seeking advice and healing. She later caused scandal by fleeing her cell. The bishop ordered her to return and resume enclosure, proving how literal and binding the vow could be. What compelled a woman to choose walls over freedom? For some, the answer was faith. For others, desperation. The church taught that a virgin's body was safest when it was unseen. Enclosure made chastity permanent. No man could claim what was locked behind stone. For women threatened with forced marriage, it was a way to reclaim ownership of the self. Yet the records also reveal inner conflict. In letters and devotional writings, anchoresses confessed loneliness and spiritual doubt. The 13th century German recluse Christina Ebner of Engelthal wrote of hearing demonic voices mocking her isolation. Another, Dorothea of Montau, recorded mystical experiences that alternated between ecstatic union and terror. The anchor-hold, it seems, amplified both holiness and madness. It was a crucible where faith and fear met without mediation. For all its austerity, the anchoritic vocation carried quiet political weight. In a society that expected women to serve through marriage and childbirth, the anchoress embodied an alternative model of service, through prayer, intellect, and counsel. Her stillness was not passive but performative. Each day, she enacted a visible refusal of worldly ambition. Parishioners saw in her window a living contradiction, a woman revered not for beauty or fertility, but for withdrawal. In rejecting marriage, the anchoress did not flee the world entirely. She redefined what it meant to belong to it. She transformed captivity into authorship, silence into speech. In the words of the Ancren Vis, her body is in the wall, but her heart roams through heaven. Such women existed on the knife edge between sanctity and self-erasure. Some, like Julian of Norwich, turned that tension into theology. Others vanished from record, their names lost with the crumbling of the walls that confined them. Yet collectively, they testify to an extraordinary truth about medieval womanhood, that even within the strictest hierarchies, there were forms of freedom that no law could anticipate. Freedoms born not from escape, but from stillness. For most medieval women, there was no cloistered refuge, no patron saint of solitude, no bishop willing to bless their refusal. To remain unmarried in the world was to occupy an ambiguous space, legally visible yet socially invisible, tolerated yet distrusted. These women filled the margins of manorial rolls, tax lists, and parish registers under labels that reveal as much prejudice as description: femme sole, spinster, harlot, good wife without husband. The medieval world depended on marriage as its organizing principle, not simply for reproduction, but for labor, inheritance, and morality. A married couple formed a miniature economic unit: the husband's plow and the wife's spindle, the man's legal presence and the woman's domestic management. To refuse marriage was, in effect, to refuse participation in that fundamental structure. The unmarried woman therefore stood outside the visible order of things, and society, uncertain what to make of her, invented explanations that often veered toward suspicion. In the countryside, unmarried women could survive, but rarely prosper. The manorial system, which governed rural life in much of Western Europe, allocated land through households. A peasant's rights and obligations, rents, labor dues, inheritance, were tied to his or her family status. A woman without a husband or adult son had limited claim to tenure. Yet the records show that some did hold land in their own names, particularly widows and elder daughters. The Halesowen court rolls contain dozens of entries for women who held half vergates or small garden plots. Many are labeled femmes soles, meaning they were legally independent. They could appear in court, pay rents, and even sue or be sued. But independence had costs. Without a husband to share labor or offer protection, these women often relied on hired help or kin. They were required to perform manorial work, carting, weeding, threshing, tasks that were grueling and gendered. Some supplemented their income through spinning, brewing ale, or gathering firewood, all subject to fines if done without permission. Socially, their unmarried status was read as deficiency. Village custom associated womanhood with service to a husband, family, or master. The woman who served none risked being labeled idle or immoral. English manorial courts occasionally fined loose women or vagabond maids for harboring strangers, selling ale illegally, or wandering after hours. Behind such charges often lay nothing more than the fact of being alone. The absence of male guardianship was itself suspicious. In towns and cities, the story was more complex. Urban economies, particularly in Flanders, England, and the German states, offered more opportunities for wage labor. Here, the unmarried woman could find precarious autonomy as a worker, servant, or artisan. Guild records from London, Paris, and Bruges list single women, soleil mulières, employed in the cloth and brewing trades. In 14th century Bruges, about 1/3 of adult women were unmarried, many employed in the linen industry. Spinning and weaving were feminized trades, requiring little capital but long hours. The very word spinster, first appearing in English legal documents in the 1360s, simply meant a woman who spun thread for a living. Over time, the term hardened into a social identity, and eventually, a stigma. By the early modern period, spinster came to mean an old maid, the woman who had failed to marry. In its medieval origin, however, it denoted a working woman, poorly paid but independent. Single women also ran taverns, sold bread, and traded in markets. In London's 1419 subsidy roll, over 300 women are listed as taxpayers without husbands. Some were widows, others lifelong single women. A few achieved modest prosperity, such as Alice de la Pole, a brewer who supplied Westminster Abbey. Yet the freedom of the city came with risks. Without a male relative's protection, women could be assaulted, harassed, or accused of prostitution. Municipal authorities often blurred the line between independence and immorality. Ordinances in Paris, 1367, banned women without honest occupation from living alone, associating solitude with vice. In Florence, single women were subject to curfews and required to register with parish officials. Public morality laws policed their clothing and movements, reinforcing the message that female virtue depended on supervision. For poorer single women, domestic service was the most common occupation. Nearly every large household, aristocratic, clerical, or mercantile, employed young women as servants. Many entered service in adolescence and remained until marriage or old age. Service offered food, lodging, and wages, but it also reinforced dependency. Employers often treated servants as quasi-family while maintaining strict hierarchies. For those who refused or lost such positions, destitution loomed. Some found solidarity in all-female households or informal collectives, widows sharing rent, women pooling resources to buy food and fuel. A late medieval will from York mentions the 3 single women of St. Crux parish, who lived together and prayed for their benefactors. Such small associations, though largely invisible in records, reveal how women created micro-communities of survival outside convents or families. Others joined semi-religious sisterhoods, Bisoc in Italy, reclusae in Germany, who took private vows of chastity and charity, but remained active in society. These women operated hospitals, taught girls, and performed funerals for the poor. They lived frugally, wearing grey or black gowns, and were sometimes confused with beguines. Church authorities tolerated them as long as they remained orthodox and useful. Without land, wages, or family support, many unmarried women slipped into poverty. Late medieval poor laws singled them out for regulation. The English Statute of Labourers, 1349, and later Poor Laws required able-bodied women to accept service or face punishment as vagrants. Parish registers from the 15th century record increasing numbers of wandering women begging at church doors. Single motherhood compounded the stigma. Illegitimate births carried severe penalties. Mothers could be whipped, fined, or branded as fornicatrices. In some towns, they were forced to wear distinctive clothing. Yet many continued to raise children alone, relying on charity. Records from Norwich's Alderman's Court, 1440s, show women petitioning for aid, describing themselves as poor maidens that have none husband. Their words capture both the moral and material exile of singleness. By the late 15th century, unmarried and widowed women began to appear in another role, as scapegoats. Popular superstition linked female solitude to sorcery. A woman without a husband or sons was thought to consort with devils because she had no man to protect or restrain her. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, portrayed widows and spinsters as especially prone to witchcraft. In villages, accusations often fell on older single women who lived alone, kept cats, or practiced midwifery. Though the full witch hunts belonged to the early modern era, their roots lay in the medieval fear of women who existed outside patriarchal structures. The witch was, in essence, the mirror image of the anchoress, both solitary, both powerful, but one sanctified and the other condemned. Society could accept female separation only when it served God or men, not when it served the woman herself. Ironically, the law sometimes granted more rights to single women than to wives. In English common law, a married woman, a feme covert, had no legal identity apart from her husband. A single woman, or feme soul, could own property, enter contracts, and sue in court. Urban charters occasionally protected this independence. In London, femme souls could conduct business freely, and in York, single women were taxed as householders. Yet few could accumulate wealth to exercise these rights meaningfully. Legal autonomy without economic security was an empty victory. In the end, the unmarried woman of the streets and fields occupied a paradoxical position. The church proclaimed that her virginity could be holy, but society treated her solitude as shame. The law called her free, but her survival depended on service. Between the saint and the witch, she walked a narrow, uncertain path. And yet, in the quiet endurance of these forgotten women, the spinners, brewers, nurses, and widows who kept Europe's cities and farms alive, lay a subtle defiance. They proved that a woman could live without belonging, could survive without surrender. In a world that saw marriage as destiny, their very existence was an act of resistance. The Church of the Middle Ages was not only a spiritual power, it was also the supreme arbiter of marriage. And within its courts lay the most paradoxical weapon ever given to women in a patriarchal world, the doctrine of free consent. By the 12th century, canon lawyers had transformed the theology of marriage into a legal system. Gratian's Decretum, a monumental compilation of church law, stated that a marriage was valid only when both parties consented freely and in the present tense. No dowry, priest, or witness could replace the mutual "I will." This principle, repeated in papal decrees and scholastic commentaries, meant that the girl who whispered "I do not" could, at least in theory, nullify her father's plans. It was revolutionary in writing and nearly impossible in practice. In the medieval imagination, marriage was not just a sacrament but a transaction, the joining of property, status, and kin. Consent was supposed to elevate it to a spiritual union. Instead, it became the battlefield between law and custom. Theologians like Peter Lombard, in his Sentences, Book 4, taught that consent made the marriage, while consummation perfected it. Popes reaffirmed this doctrine repeatedly. Pope Alexander III decreed that neither parent nor lord may compel a maiden to marry. But in manorial courts and parish life, parental pressure continued unabated. Fathers viewed their daughters' marriages as economic strategy. Lords viewed their tenants' daughters as sources of labor and fines. When consent clashed with custom, the result was confusion and litigation. The rise of ecclesiastical courts gave women a legal stage, one of the few in medieval society where their voices were recorded. These courts, staffed by clerics, handled cases of betrothal, annulment, bigamy, and sexual misconduct. Litigants, both men and women, testified under oath. Scribes recorded their words in Latin. Thousands of these records survive from England, France, and Italy, revealing the messy human reality behind medieval marriage. In York's consistory court, about 1/3 of all cases involved contested marriages, disputes over whether consent had been given, whether promises had been kept, or whether consummation had occurred. Women appear not as passive victims, but as shrewd legal actors. Some sued men who had seduced them under false promises of marriage. Others sought annulments from unwanted unions. The court often asked one decisive question: did you consent freely? The answers are vivid. In a 1412 York case, Agnes Baker testified that she had been compelled by her father and beaten until she said yes to a suitor. The court annulled the marriage, citing fear as invalidating consent. In another, Alice Parker claimed that she and a man had exchanged vows by night and alone, which he later denied. The judges ruled the clandestine marriage valid, to his dismay. The same law that protected unwilling brides also trapped unwilling grooms. Because consent, not ceremony, made marriage valid, couples could, and often did, marry secretly. A mutual promise spoken in the present tense, "I take you as my husband," before witnesses was legally binding, even without priest or parish announcement. This loophole allowed lovers to bypass parental control, but also produced chaos. Parents denounced such unions as sinful. Bishops denounced them as unrecorded. By the 13th century, clandestine marriages had become a social problem large enough for reform. The Fourth Lateran Council ordered the public proclamation of bans before a wedding, aiming to expose pre-existing unions or consanguinity. Yet enforcement remained inconsistent. For women, secrecy cut both ways. It allowed some to escape arranged marriages, but it also left them vulnerable if the man denied the vows. A promise whispered in a field might be binding before God, but impossible to prove in court. In one London case, a woman named Cecily of Kingston claimed she had married a man in the presence of the stars and the moon. The judge, more bureaucrat than poet, dismissed her plea for lack of witnesses. Paradoxically, the same church that enforced chastity also became a refuge for women resisting coercion. A girl threatened with an unwanted marriage could claim sanctuary in a church, literally fleeing to the altar and declaring herself under divine protection. Chroniclers describe fathers dragging daughters from church porches while priests intervened. In a notable case from 1181, recorded in the Chronicon of Roger of Hoveden, a young Englishwoman named Matilda de Senlis fled to St. Albans Abbey to avoid a forced match. The abbot defended her right to refuse, citing Alexander III's decree on consent. The suitor withdrew, and Matilda remained a lay sister at the abbey. Such episodes illustrate how women learned to use canon law as a shield. They might not read Latin, but they understood the principle. The church's own doctrine could be turned against male coercion. Not all refusals were heroic. Some women and men exploited canon law for personal gain. If a marriage proved inconvenient, politically, financially, or emotionally, one could seek annulment by claiming that consent had been coerced. Vows pre-existent, or kinship too close. Wealthy families sometimes engineered these annulments through bribery or influence. But for ordinary women, annulment was often the only escape from abuse or forced unions. Courts sometimes granted separation from bed and board, a mensa et thoro, to wives suffering violence. In 1318, the London Diocesan Court ruled in favour of Alice of Reading, who claimed her husband beat her cruelly and forced her against her will. The court ordered him to provide her maintenance while she lived apart, a rare legal recognition of marital abuse. The Church's insistence on consent also reshaped the ideal of female sanctity. Virgin martyrs of legend, Agnes, Cecilia, Lucy, were celebrated precisely for refusing pagan husbands. Their stories, copied in countless sermons and manuscripts, offered symbolic validation for real women's resistance. The message was clear. A woman's will could be holy if it served divine love rather than earthly marriage. Yet these same tales reinforced the notion that refusal was acceptable only when framed as chastity. To reject marriage for personal freedom remained sinful pride. To reject it for God was sanctity. The law of consent, therefore, opened a narrow gate. Women could claim autonomy only by surrendering it to heaven. By the 15th century, ecclesiastical courts had become a familiar, if imperfect, venue for resolving marriage disputes. Their rulings echoed across Europe, shaping later civil law. The principle that marriage required free consent would eventually re-emerge in Enlightenment thought as a foundation for modern ideas of individual rights. But in its medieval cradle, it remained a fragile compromise, born from theology, twisted by politics, and sustained by the courage of those who dared to use it. In the end, the Church's insistence that consensus facit nuptias, consent makes marriage, created a paradox it could never fully control. It granted women a theological right that social reality denied them, forcing every village and parish to confront an uncomfortable truth, that a woman's yes or her no could make or unmake the most sacred bond on earth. And in that small Latin phrase, whispered in courtrooms and cloisters alike, lay the seed of something larger than canon law, the medieval discovery that a woman's will was, at least in theory, her own. In parchment and paint, the Middle Ages told stories about women who said no. They appear in manuscripts, frescoes, and stained glass, their gestures frozen at the moment of refusal. To the medieval imagination, that no could sanctify or destroy. The same act that made a saint of Agnes could condemn a peasant girl as disobedient. The difference lay not in the refusal itself, but in who authorized it, God or the devil, heaven or pride. The earliest and most enduring models of holy defiance were the virgin martyrs, young women who rejected earthly suitors in favor of divine love. Their stories, composed in late antiquity and recopied throughout the medieval period, formed the moral template for female resistance. Foremost among them was St. Agnes of Rome, a 12-year-old noble girl executed under Diocletian for refusing marriage. Her passio circulated widely in Latin and vernacular forms. Agnes spurned the governor's son, declaring herself betrothed to Christ. When threatened with death, she replied, "I am already promised to him who is greater." Her legend was copied in English homilies, French chansons, and Italian frescoes, where she appears serene amid torment, the Lamb of Purity beside her feet. Saint Cecilia, patron of musicians, likewise resisted marriage, converting her husband instead. Saint Lucy, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch followed similar patterns. Young, beautiful, and unswerving, they refused pagan or lustful men and suffered martyrdom. Their tales blended sensual imagery and ascetic virtue. The beauty that provoked desire became the instrument of spiritual victory. Medieval preachers used these saints to instruct women in virtue. Sermons urged maidens to emulate their chastity, not their independence. The virgin martyrs' no was holy because it was obedient, directed not against male authority in general, but against a specific sinful desire. In their deaths, the Church found a way to bless female resistance while still containing it. Art reinforced this dual message. In illuminated manuscripts, virgin martyrs are often depicted holding swords, wheels, or crosses, instruments of their torture turned into symbols of triumph. Their bodies, wounded but incorrupt, conveyed the paradox of purity through suffering. In one 13th century English psalter, Catherine of Alexandria stands above the broken wheel that failed to kill her, while an angel crowns her with a wreath of roses. Such imagery offered medieval women an alternate ideal of power, one achieved not through obedience to husbands, but through spiritual integrity. Yet the cost of that power was annihilation. The Virgin's victory required her death. To live unmarried and unpunished was far more dangerous. If saints' lives celebrated spiritual defiance, secular literature punished domestic rebellion. Medieval romances, fabliaux, and moral tales are filled with warnings against the wayward maid. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Clerk's Tale tells of Griselda, a peasant wife tested by her husband's cruelty and praised for her absolute submission. Griselda is the anti-Agnes, the woman whose holiness lies in saying yes, not no. Her story, translated from Petrarch's Latin and Boccaccio's Italian, circulated widely in Europe as a model of wifely patience. Other stories mocked unmarried women as unnatural. In the French fabliau La Vieille Truande, an old spinster laments that no man would have her, and God forgot her too. Such tales reduced unmarried women to figures of ridicule, comic warnings of what awaited those who failed to marry. Between these extremes, the martyred virgin and the obedient wife, there was little cultural room for women who simply wanted to live alone. The figure who best captures the medieval tension between purity and sin is Mary Magdalene, neither virgin nor wife, but something in between. Medieval legend transformed her from a disciple of Christ into a reformed prostitute, making her a model of repentance rather than refusal. She embodied the possibility of redemption through submission to divine love, a counterpoint to the stubbornness of women who refused both marriage and repentance. In sermons and mystery plays, the Magdalene's transformation offered comfort to women who had strayed from chastity. But it also reinforced the idea that autonomy was sinful unless surrendered to God. Even redemption required dependence. Despite the Church's efforts to contain them, some female saints became symbols of broader defiance. Christina the Astonishing, a Belgian mystic, famously refused marriage and lived as a recluse, performing strange feats, levitating, sleeping in ovens, crawling into coffins. Her bizarre sanctity shocked clerics, but inspired commoners who saw in her madness a protest against worldly control. Joan of Arc inherited this lineage of holy defiance. Though a product of the late Middle Ages, she embodied the same tension between obedience and rebellion. Joan refused marriage, cut her hair, and dressed as a man, acts that violated both social and ecclesiastical law. Tried for heresy and cross-dressing, she was condemned and burned, yet within a generation she was hailed as a saint. Her death, like that of the virgin martyrs, transformed personal refusal into collective salvation. For ordinary women, these stories provided moral mirrors, however distorted. Parish churches displayed frescoes of virgin martyrs beside images of Eve, the obedient bride of Christ, beside the rebellious mother of sin. The message was plain: female will was powerful but dangerous. Properly directed, it made saints; misdirected, it made sinners. And yet the endurance of these legends hints at a fascination that bordered on admiration. The Virgin's defiance thrilled even those who feared it. Her story allowed medieval society to imagine a woman who could say no, so long as she did it for God. Outside the Latin and literary tradition, folk tales preserved earthier versions of female resistance. In English and German ballads, stubborn maidens often outwitted suitors or used clever tricks to delay marriage. The Scots ballad, The Broomfield Hill, tells of a woman who pretends to sleep to test her suitor's honor, while The Maid and the Palmer reimagines the Virgin Mary as a wandering penitent who has evaded men's advances. In these popular retellings, refusal becomes wit rather than sanctity, a survival tactic rather than a creed. They hint at an undercurrent of folk feminism, the belief that a clever woman could navigate male power not through obedience, but through cunning. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the unmarried woman had splintered into archetypes: the virgin martyr, the holy anchoress, the witch, the widow, the spinster, the fool. Each reflected society's struggle to define female autonomy. Yet through all these variations runs a single thread: the unease provoked by female refusal. Medieval art and literature could not quite suppress their admiration for these women. Even when it mocked or punished them, it preserved their memory. The stained glass of Chartres Cathedral still glows with the image of St. Catherine crushing her wheel. The carvings at Norwich still depict Margaret wrestling the dragon. Beneath their legends lies a shared defiance. Each stood alone, and each chose death or hardship over obedience. The culture that canonized them also feared them, but it could not forget them. For in every sermon, every manuscript illumination, every miracle tale retold to restless parishioners on winter nights, the medieval world rehearsed the same dangerous question: What happens when a woman's will is her own? To reject marriage in the Middle Ages was not only to refuse a husband, it was to refuse an entire economic system built around exchange. Marriage was a transaction as much as a sacrament, binding families through money, land, and alliances. A woman who declined it disrupted a network of debts, dowries, and inheritances that underpinned the social order. Her no reverberated in coin and parchment as much as in conscience. Across medieval Europe, marriage was a fiscal event. In most regions, a daughter's marriage required a dowry, a payment from her natal family to her husband or his kin. In return, the groom often offered a dower, the property assigned to his wife for her support in widowhood. Together, dowry and dower formed the economic architecture of matrimony, ensuring that women carried value from one household to another. The dowry was rarely optional. Families without sufficient means to endow all their daughters faced hard choices: marry some, send others to convents, or leave the rest dependent. In Florence, dowries were so essential to marriage that the city created public funds, the Monte delle Doti, to help families save for their daughters' futures. Girls were registered at birth with small deposits that matured when they married or took vows. Those who never did forfeited their accounts. In peasant and artisan families, the sums were smaller, but the stakes no less severe. A father who could not provide a dowry risked social embarrassment and reduced his daughter's prospects. To refuse marriage might relieve him of that obligation, but it also deprived the family of alliances and labor. Inheritance customs often punished daughters who disobeyed. A woman who rejected a suitable match could lose her share of property or movable goods. Charters and wills reveal the language of exclusion. In a 1294 English will, a yeoman left to my daughter Isabel, who took no husband as was counselled her, only 5 shillings and God's mercy. In northern France, the courtroom de Paris allowed fathers to cut off disobedient daughters who refused arranged marriages, labeling them rebelles à leur lignée. These clauses codified the belief that a daughter owed her family obedience in exchange for inheritance. Refusal broke the contract, yet some families used the convent as a financial compromise. A religious vocation required a monastic dowry smaller than a marriage portion but still significant. By placing a daughter in a convent, a family could maintain social respectability while reducing cost. In aristocratic households, such placements were routine, less an act of faith than of finance. In rare cases, daughters challenged disinheritance in court. The York Consistory Court heard several disputes in which women argued that their refusal had been lawful because the suitor was unsuitable or sinful. While ecclesiastical judges ruled on the moral dimension, civil courts handled the property fallout, a jurisdictional tangle that often left the woman without remedy. Widowhood offered the closest thing to financial independence most women could achieve. A widow, unlike an unmarried maiden, controlled her dower lands outright and could trade, lend, or sue in her own name. Many deliberately avoided remarriage to preserve that autonomy. Records from the English city of York in the late 14th century list numerous widows conducting business, lending money, renting houses, and managing workshops. One, Agnes de la Pole, lent funds to the city government itself. Others served as executors of wills and guardians of minors. The widow's independence made her both respected and resented, an honest woman who did not need a man's license to act. But widowhood was double-edged. Without heirs or strong kin networks, many widows fell into poverty once their dower expired. The church praised them for chastity, but discouraged them from managing wealth too freely. Clerical writers like Thomas Aquinas warned that widows were prone to avarice and should live in modesty. Municipal statutes often restricted widows' economic activity, requiring male agents for large transactions. Unmarried women without family support had to make their own way, and many did so through small-scale commerce. Town records show single women leasing stalls in marketplaces, selling bread, cloth or ale. In Norwich's Leet Court rolls, women appear as brewers, midwives and hucksters. They face double taxation, paying both civic and guild fees without the benefit of a husband's membership. Ale brewing, one of the few crafts dominated by women, exemplified their economic ingenuity. Judith Bennett's study of medieval brewsters shows that single women ran profitable taverns across England until male guilds restricted them in the 15th century. The church tolerated brewing as honest work, but preachers often mocked alewives in sermons as greedy or lustful, a moral veil over economic competition. Textile production also provided employment. Spinners, weavers and seamstresses were essential to the cloth industry, particularly in Flanders and England. Yet wages were meager, and guild exclusion left most working single women in precarious poverty. Their labor fueled urban economies but earned little social recognition. Economic vulnerability translated into moral danger. The church's suspicion of single women as potential sinners intertwined with their financial insecurity. Sermons warned that idleness led to temptation, a coded way of urging poor women to marry or enter service. Charitable institutions, such as hospitals and almshouses, sometimes required female residents to vow chastity, effectively transforming poverty relief into quasi-religious discipline. In some towns, the civic authorities instituted dowry funds for poor girls to encourage marriage and prevent prostitution. Venice's Scuola di Santa Maria della Carità, founded 1260, gave annual dowries to honest maidens without fathers. Such charities had an explicit moral aim to convert potential spinsters into wives. The unmarried woman, if left unsupported, threatened both the economy and the soul of the city. And yet, some women learned to turn the system's own logic against it. In London's court rolls, a widow named Johanna Hill refused a second marriage arranged by her sons, declaring that a woman's goods are her own when her lord is gone. She rewrote her will to leave her property to nieces and godchildren rather than male heirs. Similarly, merchant daughters in Italian cities sometimes used convent dowries as bargaining tools, entering religious life temporarily and later rejoining the world with their assets intact. A few noble women wielded even greater financial power. Christine de Pisan, widow of a royal secretary, supported her family through writing and political patronage, an extraordinary feat in a male-dominated world. Her treatise, The Book of the City of Ladies, argued that women's virtue and intellect deserved recognition equal to men's wealth. Her life exemplified economic resistance. Through intellect, she turned dowry dependence into literary income. Inheritance laws varied by region, but almost everywhere, the unmarried woman stood at a disadvantage. In England, under primogeniture, land passed to sons. Daughters received movable goods or token payments. In parts of southern France, where partible inheritance was common, daughters shared property more equally, giving them greater incentive to remain single and control their shares. In the Low Countries, women could inherit and manage property freely, which may partly explain the flourishing of Beguine communities there. Single women could afford it. By the 15th century, notarial records from Ghent, Bruges and Brussels show women buying and selling houses, lending money and leaving wills naming other women as heirs. Their economic agency persisted despite moral censure, proving that refusal did not always lead to ruin. Some carved modest prosperity out of a system designed to deny them one. For every woman who mastered these financial strategies, dozens more paid the price. The woman who refused marriage forfeited more than inheritance. She forfeited security. Her survival depended on work, charity, or luck. Yet the endurance of spinsters, widows, and businesswomen across medieval Europe suggests that economic exclusion never fully achieved its goal. The dowry system sought to make women's futures dependent on men. Instead, it produced a shadow economy of female labor, lending and mutual aid, invisible to chroniclers, but vital to survival. Refusal carried cost, but also creativity. Through ledgers, wills, and quiet bargains, unmarried women redefined wealth itself, not as property held, but as independence earned. For medieval theologians, the unmarried woman was both promise and peril, a soul freed from carnal sin, yet untethered from the safeguards of hierarchy. In her chastity lay the image of spiritual perfection, in her independence the seed of rebellion. To understand how the Church viewed women who rejected marriage, one must enter the anxious, contradictory world of medieval theology, where the same sermons that exalted virginity also warned against female freedom. From the early Church onward, virginity had been praised as the highest form of female holiness. Saint Jerome declared in the 4th century that marriage replenishes the earth, virginity fills heaven. Augustine agreed that virginity was superior, but only when grounded in humility and obedience. These patristic ideas shaped medieval theology. The virgin's body was imagined as a fortress of purity, her renunciation of sex a triumph over the fallen flesh of Eve. Monastic writers like Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Damian in the 12th century further romanticized virginity as a mystical marriage to Christ, the Sponsor Christi ideal that animated convent life. The consecrated virgin symbolized the Church itself, pure and faithful. Yet this ideal existed in tension with social reality. Virginity was praised when enclosed, feared when free. A virgin under vows was sacred. A virgin who simply refused men was suspect. To theologians, freedom without obedience was singularitas, the sin of singularity. It meant setting one's own will above communal or divine order. The unmarried woman who lived alone, dressed distinctively, or refused the counsel of family and priest could thus be accused of pride, even if she remained chaste. The 12th century moralist John of Salisbury warned that the solitary woman is an untamed beast, for she lacks the yoke of man or monastery. The 13th century preacher Jacques de Vitry, describing Béguines, noted approvingly that some lived virtuously, but condemned others who wander without rule or obedience. This language reveals the Church's deepest fear, that female spirituality might exist outside its supervision. Behind these anxieties lay an old story, that of Eve, whose act of choice had brought sin into the world. Medieval theologians interpreted female disobedience through that lens. To say no to a man, even for moral reasons, risked echoing the first woman's defiance. Preachers warned that women who refused marriage might fall into superbia, pride masquerading as virtue. In his Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas acknowledged virginity as superior to marriage, but insisted it must serve God, not self. If a woman abstains from marriage out of disdain for it, rather than devotion, she sins not by body, but by will. Thus, the unmarried woman's virtue was constantly tested, not only for chastity, but for intention. Was she humble or proud? Holy or selfish? Every choice of celibacy risked misinterpretation. Medieval theology viewed the female body as porous and unstable, requiring male or clerical control. Virginity symbolized containment, the closed garden of the Song of Songs. But the unmarried woman outside convent walls complicated this metaphor. She possessed the same chastity, yet lacked the enclosure that proved it. Medical theories reinforce the suspicion. According to Galenic humorism, women were colder and wetter than men, their bodies prone to excess and imbalance. An unmarried woman, it was thought, risked sickness if her reproductive fluids were unreleased. Physicians like Trotula of Salerno warned of the suffocation of the womb, a condition supposedly cured by marriage or menstruation. Even learned medicine pathologized female solitude. Preachers turned such theories into moral warnings. Sermons described solitary women as special targets of the devil. The Malleus Maleficarum would later codify this belief, claiming that women's weakness made them the devil's gateway. But the association was older. In a 13th century sermon collection, a friar told of a maiden who lived alone to preserve her chastity, only to be deceived by a demon disguised as an angel. Her fall served as a cautionary tale against unregulated piety. Such stories blurred spiritual independence with danger. The woman who refused marriage might become a saint or a witch. The difference lay in who told her story. Despite its anxiety, the church could not suppress unmarried women entirely. The reality of social imbalance, widows, orphans, surplus daughters, made them unavoidable. Local clergy developed pragmatic accommodations. Some women took private vows of chastity before a priest without joining an order. Others lived as devout women, mulieres religiosæ, attached to parish churches. They prayed, fasted, and worked for charity under loose supervision. By tolerating such arrangements, the church quietly admitted that not all holiness could be institutionalized. Theologians like Jean Gerson recognized the sincerity of lay female devotion, but urged bishops to guide it, lest zeal turn to heresy. His caution reflected an old fear: ungoverned virtue was only a step from error. The church sought to resolve its discomfort through metaphor. If a woman would not belong to a man, she could belong to Christ. The title Sponsa Christi, Bride of Christ, became the ultimate form of spiritual domestication. It allowed women to express independence within the grammar of possession. The imagery was deeply erotic. Nuns were exhorted to imagine Christ as lover, to wear his ring, to keep themselves pure for him. Mystical writers like Hildegard of Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg used this imagery with creative subversion, describing union with God in language that blurred human and divine desire. Their writings reimagined chastity not as repression, but as transformation. Yet clerics often sanitized their words, interpreting them as allegories of obedience. The church allowed women to be brides of Christ, but never his equals. In sermons and confession manuals, the image of the unmarried woman functioned as a moral mirror for society. She embodied the contradictions of medieval Christianity: fleshly yet holy, weak yet strong, submissive yet untamed. Preachers both praised and ridiculed her, using her example to instruct others in moderation. In the Dominican sermon from the late 13th century, a friar compared women to musical instruments. The married woman is the lute, tuned by her husband's hand. The nun is the harp, played by God. But the woman who will not be tuned is only noise. This metaphor captures the church's unease. It could not imagine female virtue outside control, yet it could not deny its existence. Ultimately, the unmarried woman threatened not only social order, but theological coherence. She exposed a flaw in the church's logic. If virginity was holier than marriage, then those who freely chose it should be revered. Yet when they did so without permission, they became heretics or outcasts. Her very existence revealed the gap between doctrine and practice, between the church's veneration of chastity and its fear of autonomy. Medieval theology never resolved this contradiction. Instead, it circled it endlessly, in treatises, confessions, and sermons, translating fear into metaphor, control into sanctity. The unmarried woman became, in the Christian imagination, both the virgin and the temptress, both Eve and Mary. In her, the church saw the possibility of perfection, and the terrifying reminder that obedience was not the same as holiness.